Hello, welcome back. Thanks for coming back for the third and final session of today's Adult Ally Summit. It is our afternoon panel moderated by Evie Roberts and featuring Sean Jeffers, Karen Lackey, Kevin Rigby, and Beth Thomas. Final reminders before we begin, though you're really tired of hearing it, but in order to comply with ethical standards of continuing education, CEUs will be awarded based on your actual time in this session. If you are only able to attend part of the session, your CE hours will be adjusted accordingly. But again, if you need to log out and log back in to fix whatever audio or video problems may be happening, that's fine. It will not affect your CEs. You'll only receive your CEs if you are logged into the session on a computer or a tablet. If you're sharing a computer or if you have called in, we can't track your attendance, and so therefore we will not be able to give you CEs. We'll get an evaluation at the end of today. It'll come to you via an email from GoToTraining about an hour after this is over. So it should arrive around 4:30. And then please fill it out because it is the only way that we can improve and get better, but also it's necessary for your CEs. And certificates will be emailed to you 30 days-ish after today's summit. And please remember, again, it is an interactive session, so please take part, participate, make full use of that chat box, and take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Brittany. So since this is going to be conversation-based, Brittany, would you mind removing that slide so that way we'll just have our slate of webcams across the dash? And I can hear an echo, so I think that a few people might need to mute themselves. All right, how do I sound now? Echoey, like I'm in a cave. Brittany, if you wouldn't mind checking to see if we can mute anybody. Maybe we've already taken care of it though. Okay, cool. So thank you all for joining us. We are still recording from the last session, so I'm just gonna let that keep rolling. We've all had the pleasure today of hearing from two amazing speakers, Dr. Chris Holloman on Mindset GPS and Albert Gay on racial trauma. So we also have panelists from our Regional Learning Collaborative leaders here to share their reflections on those two presentations, and then just to help other adult allies reconcile the implications for those presentations within each of our own youth-led programs. So as we speak to one another, I encourage all of you in the audience to type your own responses into my questions into the chat box. So just like our youth, we oftentimes learn best from our peers. And so while we would ordinarily have these conversations in small groups together in an in-person session, today we're just gonna have this panel and do the best that we can. But I certainly wanna encourage you guys to submit your own responses into that chat box. So today I have 4 Regional Learning Collaborative leaders who have volunteered to sit on the panel. They're from different parts of the state, and all of them are in charge of supporting adult allies in their region. We hope that after today's panel, you'll be inspired to reach out to these as well as our other RLC leaders for additional support and technical assistance. So to start, I'd like each of our panelists to offer just a 1 or 2 sentence introduction of themselves. And who wants to start?
I'll jump in, and then I'll toss it to Karen. So I'm Sean Jeffers. I'm with Youth at the Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, and lead our Southwest Ohio Adult Allies group. So this morning when you did the map with Chris, if you did any of the counties down in Southwest Ohio, would love to have you join us and for our conversations we'll be having this year. And then Karen, I'll pass it to you.
Can you hear me? I'm having trouble. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's a lot of feedback.
Can you I'm gonna move my computer to another part of the room.
Yeah. Do you have a cell phone? You might also try to call in so you can use your webcam for us to see you, but then also call in for different sound quality.
Hi, I'm Beth Thomas. I have the pleasure of serving Northwest Ohio as an adult ally. So again, just like Sean, we don't always have a lot of participants in Northwest Ohio, but we would love to have you. And since they'll all be virtual this year, you don't have to be from Northwest Ohio to join us. And I'll hand it off to Kevin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Rigby. I work for Youth International and Comp Drug here in Columbus, Ohio, and along with my supervisor, Cheryl Sells, we lead up the Central region. We call it the Central Connection. So anyone who is interested in being part of that, please check it out. Check out what we do, and hope to connect with you all.
Okay, I'm trying this again.
All right, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? No,
It's slightly better. So maybe if you just slow down your speech, that might make it worthwhile.
I'm also going to turn off my video, which seems to help. And I'm Karen Lackey. I'm here from Northeast Ohio. Go Cleveland. I represent the Regional Learning Collaborative and have been involved with Youth Led since the very beginning. Love it. Cannot wait to talk to you. And these are a couple great speakers. You guys did great.
Thank you so much, Karen. And my name is Evie Roberts. I hope that I saw all of you guys this morning, but in case anybody is just now joining us, I'm the Youth-Led Prevention Coordinator at Prevention Action Alliance. So I have the pleasure of working with the Ohio Youth-Led Prevention Network, the Ohio Adult Allies, and the Youth Council. It's really exciting because for me, this place is a major opportunity for me to learn from those around me, such as all of our RLC leaders. So we have a small contingent of them represented in this call today, or this webinar today. But I'm really grateful to be able to have the opportunity just to watch and listen from all of their wisdom. So I'm sure that I'm going to get as much out of this panel as anybody else. So for the first question, just to kind of warm everybody up, Dr. Holloman talked today about, what's our reason for engaging in youth-led work? So I'm curious if a few of our panelists could just share, what are some things that came to mind for why you do this work in the first place?
Well, the one thing that I wrote down first, and this was before I even knew there was such a program or framework as Youth Led, it simply comes down to really respecting and valuing youth. I've never done any work with youth where I didn't include them or ask them, for what their perspective was, what they knew. They know their world, adults don't, but yet we're the ones that design the programs for them. So when I saw Youth Led, I was like, wow, this is a thing, this is a framework. Loved it, absolutely loved it.
Thank you so much, Karen.
I agree with Karen. I come to this work with just a love for young people and an appreciation for what they have to share. And selfishly, I get more out of working with them than I think they ever get out of working with me.
I'm going to tell Beth that's completely untrue because like a lot of the rest of you, I work with young people just because I know what working with a positive adult did for me when I was young. So I know that by working alongside these young people, I'm providing them a connection to a caring adult that they may or may not have, but at least it's an additional one if they already have a handful, and that impact helps me to continue to want to do my job at a high level because I know I'm impacting them not just for now, but for the future as well.
Yeah, mine is very similar. I think just around, recognizing there was adults that were supportive when I was growing up, but also that there were situations where I didn't feel like I could bring my full self into, and wanting to make sure we really create that to help young people feel capable of what they have to contribute and kind of positively being able to shape their surroundings.
Thank you all for sharing that. I really appreciate hearing some of your motivations and your approaches to the work. I imagine a lot of people here can empathize and probably have similar stories to that. I'm next curious, we have a question from Dr. Holloman. He wanted to know which of the three mindsets most resonated with you in terms of the challenges that you have with young adults. So I'll remind everybody that those three mindsets are growth, purpose, and relevance. and sense of belonging. And audience members, remember that you guys can also put into the chat. So out of those three mindsets, what most resonated with you in terms of challenges that you have working with young adults?
I'm going to say it before everyone else says it, especially Sean, because I would assume he's going with this one too. But definitely sense of belonging. I mean, as a young person in youth-led prevention and as an adult working with young people in youth-led prevention, we don't get anywhere until our young people feel like they're connected to us, connected to our program. They feel like they belong. We can't move forward in any aspect of our programming until they feel safe, until they feel valued, and until they feel a part of what we're doing. So that purpose and relevance is second, for us to even get to providing them with ideas and thoughts about having a growth mindset. I mean, just the idea that they feel a part of something and that they belong is just top notch. That's the top for us.
Yeah, I agree, Kevin. And I think for me, the piece is so much of our work is around, right, especially I think with Mr. Gay's presentation this afternoon was a lot around looking at, trauma. And, and a lot of times when dealing with ACEs or trauma or these things with our young people, it also requires resilience, and resiliency factors is something that comes into a lot to our work. And there's a bit of tension that has to kind of play out sometimes to engage in resiliency factors. So if there's not that connection and sense of belonging, then sometimes you don't get that opportunity to work with young people long-term on being able to invest in some of those ways that we can maybe provide supports or guidance. And so I think that is an important part of, so I like, even though he did the GPS model, I kind of like, when I was taking notes, I was like, it's more the SPG model, I think, is like in that flow to get to a point where we can really engage enough with young people to get them maybe that growth mindset and see those potential.
I really appreciate that. And I'm just going to point out that you've got a lot of agreement in the chat box too, Kevin. Go ahead, Beth.
Oh, and I was just going to say, I agree with you guys, but it also made me think when we were talking about what brought us to this work and this idea about creating a safe space and what are we doing as adult allies to make sure that safe space exists so we can ensure people have that sense of belonging, because I think those two go hand in hand too. And I know historically speaking, I'm no longer directly involved in the day-to-day operations of our youth-led prevention group. We have struggled to attract youth to our group that represent our entire community. And so it makes me think about that sense of belonging and what can we be doing as adult allies to make sure that we are being incredibly inclusive in not only getting them to the table, but retaining them once they've arrived. And I'd love to hear some of the other adult allies' thoughts about how that has been successful for them.
Oh, Karen, I think you're, oh, sorry, go ahead. It just came through.
Yeah, I was not sure if you were going to be able to hear me, so I'll try to go really slowly. But I think just bringing them to the table is a challenge, but I think the other thing is, to both of your points, the critical importance of creating that sense of belonging, that group cohesion, that group process. It is huge. It is huge for everything. But I think part of the challenge is, back to your original question, Evie, is that I think kids themselves, I would pick growth mindset as the challenge, because we do not give kids a growth mindset. One of the speakers mentioned state testing. Yay, I love that. Because we have never given our kids the opportunity to fail and be okay. We just don't. It scares them to death. It creates anxiety that we've given them through all of this testing plan for years. And secondarily, I believe it was a second speaker that was talking about trauma. We assume that just by being there for kids, that if they're impacted by any trauma, they can get over it. No, you have to teach them skills and strategies they don't know. And I think that's what I love about youth-led and what's the challenge, is it does teach strategies. Whether they know they're learning them or not, it teaches them skills, whether they know they're learning them or not. It's not a skills class. They're doing things. And finally, part of our model is let them fail. trust the process. That's part of the model. And I think that alone empowers kids so much to fail, understand, because we collect data, why that is, and then try again. Oh my gosh, it's so magical when it actually works. And you almost see relief come off of their face when it works. It's very good to see.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate, I feel like you're offering a permission structure for adult allies to be vulnerable when you talk about the importance of failure. Because sometimes we don't want to admit that our young people are not doing as well as we want them to. And there's a real tension in that with COVID, because we know that our young people are really struggling, but we still have deliverables that we're supposed to meet. We still have expectations that we're supposed to meet. And so being able to balance that with the supports that what we need to offer our young people so that they still have a space to be able to grow and thrive can be really difficult. I want to echo what I read in the comments from Lori Pavisil, who, like me, is actually struggling with that purpose and relevance. So for my young people, some of them have reported that that our work in youth-led prevention doesn't seem as relevant to them as it did back in February, because what does a social media post here or some of the potential activities that we have planned mean for a world that is reckoning with a pandemic and the second coming of the American Civil Rights Movement? We were focused on vaping last year this time. We got super into it, did an entire conference here at Prevention Action Alliance, and the youth were working on a toolkit. And then COVID hit and nobody cared about vaping anymore. And I completely understand. And that's something that I've kind of seen some adult allies struggling with on and on again, is trying to figure out, what's the role that we have to play in building purpose and relevance in our young people that join us in youth-led programs. Because we can either exclusively recruit young people who are already very busy and are passionate for the work, or we can have kind of a Big Ten approach and welcome anybody who's willing to give us a shot and then try to show them how the work is relevant to them. So I'm curious for our panelists, if you could talk a little bit about how you balance that approach, or if you have one strategy over another with regard to recruiting young people who have a purpose and relevance for youth-led programs in their life.
Evie, I think that's a really good question. And just a couple points. One, I think we have to be willing to be vulnerable as adult allies and give ourselves grace. As you mentioned, we may not be able to meet the deliverables, the expectations we had for our groups, given the pandemic, and focus just shifted elsewhere. So I think that's a key piece too. And I also think we need to be thinking about what is relevant to the young people. I know for our youth-led prevention group this year, they shifted to mental wellness. That was a more relevant issue to them. And I think allowing them, if your funding allows it, to figure out what that balance is. So you might need to shift to where the young people find it most purposeful at this time.
I would agree 100%. Just had a conversation this morning with one of our coordinators, and I like the big tent right now. One, because of sense of belonging, everybody wants connection. Everybody wants belonging. It's one of the basic trauma responses. We want to connect. So the good time to welcome anyone. Yeah, and here was the difference. Back to our deliverables and kids striving for success. Right now, we discussed, because our group decided they wanted to do just a Christmas activity for their peers to make their together. We didn't have a plan that. We didn't put it through the script. We didn't do any of that. And they loved it. They were so energized. They wanted to do it. We're like, let them do it. Let them have in, for God's sake, I don't know if that's on the spot, but it works. It brought more people in the time. It made them feel connected and made them feel welcome. So it's gonna bear fruit. I think it's something.
Yeah, I appreciate that flexibility, especially since as we've heard, and I really loved whenever Kevin and Cheryl talked about this on a PA coffee clutch a few weeks ago, the things that we think are working might not work next week. So we have a plan that we built with, the 5, 6, 15 young people who were in attendance, and then the next week things fall apart because of X, Y, and Z reasons. So that extra flexibility at this time and recognition of all the struggles that we're dealing with is sometimes going to be needed on the fly to be able to do something that brings young people back the next time.
I'm going to interject here really quick. It is super hard to understand you, Karen, because of your your audio issues that are happening. If you have a headset that has a microphone, kind of like I see Lori wearing, like that came with your phone, that might help, having something plugged in the microphone, or if you could just speak even slower, that might help as well. A couple people say that you're only getting about every third word or so, and it is cutting in and out. So just little.
Thanks, Brittany. I wonder, Karen, if all else fails, if you could even just put all of your responses in the chat, and then we can respond that way. Any other thoughts from the rest of our panelists, or should we move on to the next question?
I think one thing I'll just offer up is, in Cincinnati, there's an event we do every year called Young Not Silent. And I will say it started out in the city of Cincinnati. It started out at City Hall in Cincinnati, and it was called the City of Cincinnati's Youth Commission of Cincinnati Citywide Youth Summit was like the first name. And so in the first 2 years, it was run out of City Hall, and then we started organizing it. And when we talked to young people about it, they're like, that sounds like a name adults came up with, which it was, because it came out of a city council office. And so when we started asking young people, what do you want to call it? And the name they've come up is Young Not Silent. And the idea is like to flip on its head that old adage of children should be seen and not heard. So every year when we do that event, we survey young people and we say, what are those issues you're not silent about? And ask them to give us a list of issues, and really thinking about what are the things they're passionate about, and then finding outlets for ways that they can respond. So at our summit, it's maybe doing workshops around some of those different things, and bringing in, experienced facilitators who have those pieces. And so I think a lot of it is, there is a point, Danelle, maybe I'm saying your name, but I really like what you put in the chat about, I think that relevance and purpose also helps people really understand, why am I here? So once they're included and then feel like they have a voice and a contribution, I think those two things really go hand in hand. So I do think it's important to look at like how we're creating a space. And I think, as Beth said, like sometimes as adults and as organizations, our funding is limited. But we have to make sure that we try to find ways that we don't limit young people's choices and opportunities just because of a funding stream, but thinking about how we can be creative to help really our young people being able to pursue the things that they're most passionate about. So I think there's that balance of striking,
Yeah, thank you. It's really incredible how you're able to rely on tried and true methods that you guys have integrated into your organization structure and operations for years to be able to continue showing young people that you value their opinion and that you want them to share even more about the things that they're already interested in. So another question that we had from our first presenter, he wanted to know what's one revelation that you had about mindsets as a result of the presentation.
I think one of the big things that stood out to me was pretty close, I think, to the beginning, right away. He said something to the extent of like that we're the bridge, and I believe I just see that to be so true, especially when we're talking about youth-led prevention or youth-led programs and adult allies, is that a lot of times we can get into this mode or come into this field and say, well, this is youth-led. Everybody, like the youth need to be doing this. They need to be recruiting. They need to be doing all this stuff. And all of what we heard today, none of that initially falls on our young people. Like, we're the bridge. And there's so much for us to be doing too, to create these spaces like Beth was talking about. There's so much that us as adult allies, and that's that key term of being an adult ally. There's so much that does fall on us to start creating these spaces and be the bridge for our young people to start that learning, growth, and contributing. And I think we get that can just get lost sometimes, and that's just something that stood out to me, is that there's so much work that we have to put into that maybe doesn't show up in the stat sheet.
That's great. Something that I've thought about since I'm now obsessed with Hamilton, since it's on Disney Plus. I came to the party a little late. There's this song called "The Room Where It Happens," and Thomas Jefferson talks about how he picks the venue, the seating, but he's not the main interlocutor in that conversation. He's the person who creates conditions for a history-changing conversation to take place. and he talks to the other people and brings them to the table. Not that I would ever want to be Thomas Jefferson in a metaphor, but for the purposes of this song, that's essentially the person that we are, is the person who's creating those conditions for success. So thank you very much, Kevin.
I love that, Kevin. And then it makes me think about, for myself, I have a tendency to be very goal oriented. I want to accomplish this list of things. And it was a real good reminder of me that the process is probably twice as important as the outcome. And along those same lines, sometimes because of funders or expectations or following a framework, we get in our head that we have to go through a checklist, so to speak, and accomplish all these things. And he just reminded me again that it is very much about that process and making sure we're leaving enough time for young people to reflect, so that learning takes place during that reflection time, and not just doing the engaging hands-on activity that's interactive, but leaving them that space to really reflect, so that learning kind of cements inside their brain. And that's the thing that really stuck out for me today.
Yeah, there was thanks, Beth, and I think there was a piece that Dr. Hillman talked about where he said, like, when he was about the belonging uncertain, and he was like, just because you had a great session last time doesn't mean like it's automatically going to continue. And I think sometimes as adults, we're like, oh, we had a really good session, everyone's bonded now, so now we can just jump into the work and like move forward. What is like, right? Like sometimes the new young people show up, or there's different people in the spaces, and so some of those things. I think it was just a good reminder that like, every time we got to like, especially I think when we're virtually, like finding those ways to like bring people back in, make those connections, and not just assume like we've done that, check the box, move on. And I think we do that, but it was just a good reminder to, to keep that in, in our plans as we're bringing on, creating agendas and working with our young people to set up sessions.
Thank you. And audience members, I would love to hear some of your revelations that you've had in the chat box. We've got about 15 minutes before I want to turn it over to audience questions. So I'll move on to our second presentation today with Mr. Albert Gay. So he talked about the potential of youth of color experiencing a trauma response as a result of witnessing racial violence. We know that young people have different responses to different events, and so we shouldn't assume that our youth of color have had a particular reaction to something that we've heard about on the news. So I'm curious, what's your advice for checking in with young people to understand how they might have been impacted by an act of collective trauma?
One thing that comes up with us is in our work, like anytime when we're doing workshops, trainings, and things, one of the ways we frame it is what we call a know, feel, do. And the idea is like, what do you want people to kind of leave knowing, feeling, and doing as a result of the conversation? And we know, and I think Albert talked about this in his presentation, right? Like schools, oftentimes it's been very transactional in their approach. It's oftentimes been more like know this than regurgitate it on a test. And so a lot of times our young people don't get that moment for feeling. And I think, and that's sometimes an important part, is just ask people about, how are you feeling right now? How's this issue? If there's something that they're kind of coming, how's that making you feel? It's taking those times to kind of get young people to talk about that. Another thing you can do is, and you can find them, there's all sorts of different like color wheel charts online that have different feelings and emotions. Because also, if we've not practiced saying how you're feeling, we don't have, I don't know, sometimes fine. And then we think it's like really unsatisfactory that a young person says fine, because we're like, give me more. And it was like, that might not be in their vocabulary. So if you print out one of those charts or you put it up on a screen, then people can kind of look. And sometimes there's like, fun, or they're like, oh, that's a word like I haven't thought about, like, and so sometimes there's ways to just generate conversation, but we allow them a moment to think about, and you giving them the tools to think about feeling.
I really like that. The feeling wheel seems like it might work pretty well through virtual means, because you could pop it up, and then if you're on Zoom, then maybe people can like draw on the screen. Anything else from either Kevin or Beth before we move on?
Yeah, I just want to echo that. That's something that makes it, there's like a understanding there. If you start to have that conversation, where it opens itself up for conversation. Something we do is like when we were in person, every time our young people would show up, they sign in and then they put a color like the feeling of basically the feeling wheel. They put a colored piece of paper in a box with their name on it. And if it was, you know, a red piece of paper, they know that we're going to check in with them if they drop a red one in with their name on it. And then it can open up that conversation. So what's going on? And it just makes it kind of more allowable when that's just a common thing that your young people know that you do. You're going to check in with them, and even just personal conversations. The more we're connected to them and what's going on in their lives, the more they're going to open up to us about it. The more that they can trust us, the more they're going to let us know what's going on or how they feel or what trauma they've been through, that can inform the way we do programming moving forward.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I appreciate that the options that are being suggested really allow young people to create the kind of boundary that they're interested in at that time. Because we might have young people who they're talking to other adults or other friends and they don't want to talk to us. And so us asking those questions and going too far, just assuming that it's our right to be able to talk to them about those kinds of things might not be greeted very amicably. So whenever that young person is given a mechanism to give us the permission to inquire about those really personal subjects, that might create an opportunity to really deepen and develop that relationship. It seems like it's pretty applicable to helping to answer Noreen Kyle's question about how to ask young people about the impacts that they might have experienced because of COVID. That was certainly something that I talked to my young people about in the spring. Some of them, life kind of went on as normal, and they were very upset that school got canceled and prom got canceled, but they didn't change their lives beyond that. And then other young people were afraid to walk out the door because, you know, they were really concerned that their immunocompromised parent was going to catch COVID. So there were just varying levels of response. And so it was just important for me to check in with them individually. Whenever I put out questions in the group chat, I didn't get a lot of feedback, but then me messaging them individually was when I got a torrent of responses from people just sharing how they were doing. So that was pretty effective for me. So we also learned about strategies for healing teen collective trauma, things like creating a routine, limiting exposure to social media, providing emotional support, encouraging journaling and exercise, implementing breathing exercise, and seeking professional help. So on the face of it, most of this looks like stuff that we would do individually and in private. What is the role of youth-led programming in helping young people to learn or practice these skills?
I think that so relates to the thing that examples that both Kevin and Sean just shared about the idea of creating this normalizing and creating this routine around a checking in. You could explore ways to do mindfulness together or give them those different tools. Ask what some of the positive coping strategies they're aware of, and that could be an entire curriculum one evening and discussion. And I think that is, both Kevin and Sean nailed it when they talked about providing those tools and then normalizing those behaviors. I think that is the key to empowering young people to develop positive coping skills to deal with whatever it is that they might be facing.
Thank you. And I think building on that, Beth, is like, so I'm going to put in the chat, like, this is a great web page, and it's basically 10 GIFs or GIFs depending on your regional dialectic, but that you can use for like breathing exercises. And so they're just things you can pop up sometimes, and it's really different ones that you can use to get people thinking. So I think that's around mindfulness. And I really appreciated Natalie's piece too around just sometimes the idea of what are you concerned about, or like, what's going on. Like, one of the things we have to acknowledge for a lot of our young people, right, is that like March 12th in Ohio, Governor DeWine said schools are closed. And some students haven't been around their friends or engaged in 9 months now. And so, and it was like, we just still had grant reports, and deadlines, and things that we were showing up and doing. And so sometimes just taking that moment to say, like, what are you grieving? What's something you lost this year? Maybe it was a spring play, or, the sports you wanted to do, or a summer vacation, or whatever it is that you were maybe, planning on doing this year that you didn't get to. And I think there is a lot of isolation when people are at home, but also when young people are talking, and it's like, oh, Kevin just said, or Beth just said, or Evie just said what I'm thinking, then it can at least help people feel like, okay, I'm not alone in these, not alone in what I'm feeling. So I think there's ways that some of these pieces, and so things that we've done, I think like the breathing pieces, really cool. As well, you can do like Just Dance on YouTube, like different videos, things that allow people to move, have fun, some of those pieces. And Dustin mentioned in the chat too, yoga for classrooms.
And I think the more they're connected, the more they're open to start having those conversations, leads to not only others connecting to them and moving those conversations forward, but them being connected to you. And then you get that trickle down effect of, okay, now I want to do something about it. And it leads that end goal, you still get to meet. You still get to go after those things that you get paid to go after, right? But you got to start with that connection, with that feeling piece and that understanding that you're valued and you're important, and we want to hear what you have to say. And now, how does that give you purpose? Why do these things matter to you? How do they matter to us? What can we do to start changing this in our community, or the greater area that we live in?
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it's really resonating with people in the chat too. We've got a message from Karen suggesting just building these activities into icebreakers with young people. So I think it'd be really easy to have everybody practice a breathing activity. I think sometimes if that's not normalized, it can seem a little silly. How can breathing that I do all the time make an impact? But just modeling that behavior during the activity, or even having a young person model that activity, can make a huge difference and encourage young people to start doing that more often in their lives. Lori says sometimes just recognizing that it's a really hard time to be a young person opens the door for them to be able to share. Absolutely. So Noreen asks, is it helpful to share how we have been impacted? I think that some of our panelists talked about that, and it seems like there's generally consensus to be able to open up that space to be able to talk about what people are experiencing and feeling.
Yeah, Evie, if I can say one thing on that, though, I think one thing that we do, I do think it's important for us to sometimes model, but also recognize that like young people might mirror, so we can also shape the room. So I think sometimes being willing to say like, what does it look like to put it out and just see where young people are, as opposed to saying, if I've been deeply affected by something and then I kind of make the whole room kind of come to my whim. So I think just being aware as adult allies, how we strike that balance. Like when we put it out, we can totally, I think, affirm young people and say, yes, I've been feeling that same thing. Thank you for giving voice to that. I think, and that's one of the ways we can build, but really allowing them to kind of lead where they're at. So we're kind of matching as opposed to making the climate.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an incredible addition. I've certainly done my best to try to represent myself as being a credible authority on subjects of prevention, and that I know what I'm talking about whenever I share information. And I've noticed that sometimes that means that if I share an idea, nobody wants to contradict me. Nobody wants to say something opposite. They just want to affirm. So I've had to learn to be really careful and when I'm going to share my opinion or share my response, because it could very easily be that my opinion becomes the dominant one. And that's not going to be helpful if the entire exercise is to be able to help young people explore their feelings and to be able to normalize it within the context of young people's reactions and responses. So thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we can certainly keep talking until 3:30, but I want to open it up to the audience as well. So get your guys' questions ready. I'm curious, what kinds of social norms have you witnessed within your youth-led programs that promote equity amongst youth?
Well, that's a big question, and there's a lot. I guess we could probably talk until 3:30 about that one, what we do have or what we don't have. But that's something that really did stand out to me today is, when Al said people in prevention, like we oftentimes we're doing positive work, we're doing positive youth development, youth leadership. We have these positive safe spaces. And we can fall into the trap of thinking that these major issues, especially around race and injustice, aren't happening here. Maybe we're not explicitly excluding people or explicitly creating environments that don't feel safe. but it certainly happens implicitly in our program in the middle of Central Ohio, and probably in programs all over the state, right? But how do we are we understanding that it is happening, and how much time are we going to spend to make sure that some of those things that can creep in aren't happening? One thing specifically that we do different is we don't have like a youth government administrative structure. We don't have presidents and vice presidents and leadership positions that differentiate our young people to see that, oh, every time that there's a leadership position, it's that one type of kid. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, that can work differently, but for us, we've seen that having young people just always being able to just be on that same level to provide the same, have that same voice and same level of impact has been really important.
One thing that comes to mind, and there's a book, Just Mercy, some of you might have seen it also as a film. I had a chance last year to see Bryan Stevenson, and one of the things Bryan Stevenson talked about is being proximate to the issues that we want to address. And so I think that's also important when we think about, in terms of equity, getting our young people to address issues. Sometimes young people see something on the internet or on the news and they're like, oh, we should go do that. And they have no framework, no connection, no relevance to those pieces. And so, so it makes me think about, because I think Albert Gay talked a little bit about this idea of like pageant answers, or like sometimes that adults, right? Like we like, young people will change the world. We're just going to turn it over to the young people and they'll save us. But youth also give us sometimes pageant answers. And so oftentimes they tell us things that adults want to hear, and they're like, I just want to help people. And then adults will be like, oh, isn't that so sweet? There's a young person who wants to help people. That's cute. But I always ask young people, if they say something like, you want to help people do what, and with what skills do you have to help people? Like, what knowledge do you have about the community and what skills? So it kind of gets them thinking a little bit more around those pieces. So I think that idea of being proximate, like Bryan Stevenson talks about, is really important, so that when we're making changes, we're not doing things to people that are distant or away from us, but we're impacting our community, and hopefully in a collaborative way that others are coming along and part of that choice.
All right, I appreciate all of that. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, so I'm going to ask another couple of questions until we have something from the audience. So one of the things that
Sorry. Natalie has had her hand up for a while, and I just want to make sure if she has a question or a comment, she gets a chance to unmute herself and say it, or if it's an accident, she can just let us know as well.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Anything from Natalie Manners?
You are unmuted on our end, so if you would like to speak, just unmute yourself.
I think Natalie just put her hand down. So Natalie, if you want to speak, feel free to put your hand back up or to type your question in the chat. And for the rest of you, if you guys also want to put your hand up, we'll unmute you and you guys can participate. Otherwise, we'll try to keep an eye on the chat box. So one of the things that I've heard a lot from particularly mostly white communities is that, you know, racism isn't a problem that we have to worry about because there are no people of color here. Like, that's kind of the implication. So we know that racism impacts all communities, regardless of how many people of color are actually present. So panelists, what would you say to those people who are struggling to understand the relevance of racial injustice within their mostly white communities and how that impacts their youth-led programming?
I think the thing that really struck me from what Mr. Gay shared today, he shared lots of wonderful things, but this is one that's going to keep resonating in my head, is that these little people, and I'm thinking about the little people in the different studies that he shared, grow up to be all the different professions. And that just kind of like whacked me upside the head as a person of obviously white privilege, unfortunately, but but it just really struck me, the idea that it impacts everybody, which I mean, I knew that, but just that idea that we are all going to grow up and live our lives, and that is why this is so very important from the get-go, to make sure we're doing our best to get it right.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there is such an opportunity for white people who grow up in predominantly white communities. It's easy to have that thought, and there is a truth that I can grow up and I can, if I never want to, and I live in this community, I can grow up and never have to interact with anybody that doesn't look like me. I can pull into my garage, put my garage door down, put it up, go to work, come back, go to school, whatever, and not interact in a deep way with someone that doesn't look like me. But for young people that are in youth-led prevention, we're often taking them to other spaces. We hold a conference every summer, and we have young people from all over the state of Ohio, all over the country coming, and every summer we deal with tons of issues of implicit bias from students who are coming from areas, and now they're in a room with somebody that doesn't look like them, and something gets stolen or something gets, and most of the time nothing ever is stolen, it's misplaced, or you know, like, but those things creep in all of the time, and those are the time that's when we think back to what can we be doing in youth-led prevention to make sure those things kind of don't creep in there.
Yeah, thank you. Gwen Hessen from the comments says something very similar, that people need to understand that the world is a very big place. And so folks will hopefully not stay in their communities, but grow to expand in the world. Very well said. Go ahead, Sean.
Sorry, Evie. Yeah, thanks. So I think a couple things. So one, in addition to doing youth-led work in Cincinnati, I'm also part of a group that does diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting. And like anytime we go into a school, schools will call us and they'll be like, can you just come and make us more diverse? And we like have to tell them over the phone, we do not have some diversity magic wand that we're just going to wave over your place and suddenly do this. But the idea is also that like, this is an intentional practice that you're doing before that happens. And I think as Kevin talked about, right, when we do youth programs, we're intentional about bringing people together. But if each one of us did an honest assessment, particularly those of us who are white, did an honest assessment of the people we work with on a daily basis, how many times are we in diverse spaces like we try to create for our young people? And what does that do for our own body of work? And really thinking about those ways that we're playing out. And so I think this has to be intentional, that you're creating ways to be inclusive, and inclusive, while race is, I think, by far the most important based on our history of our country, there's a lot of other ways to be inclusive around LGBTQ students and students experiencing mental health challenges. And so there's a lot of invisible identities as well that we think about for our young people. And so I think those are some of the things as well around being intentional, that, you know, creating environments that when people come in, then they can feel that they're part of, and it's been some thought already given to how we invite and embrace different audiences, as opposed to once somebody comes up and we're like, now, I don't know, like if you get a trans student in your school or something, you're like, well, we don't know what to do with a trans student. Like, where do they go to the bathroom? What do they change in the locker room? Like, what, and like, how do we enter them in the system? Like, so then people suddenly get all these questions, and then now the student feels othered because no thought was given to about how we making space for them. And so I think so much of this is about how are we intentionally planning in advance of doing this work, and not just hoping that there's some magic diversity wand that is going to solve these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. We might tell ourselves that, oh, go ahead. I heard somebody speaking up. Maybe that was unintentional. Yeah, but I appreciate Sean's last point, that just because our communities or our groups look one way one day, it might look completely different tomorrow. So Elliot Page came out as transgender yesterday. This is a reminder that trans people might make the decision at any point to be able to share their identity with the world. And also a reminder that young people are recognizing their LGBTQ status at a much younger age. And so we as adult allies need to understand the appropriate way to be able to respond to and welcome what they're sharing with their lives. Now, obviously, a person of color doesn't have to disclose their identity in the same way but we also need to be ready to be able to support all kinds of of young people who look different from us, or who come from different backgrounds. I really appreciate what Danelle Williams said. When you truly want to assist people, we judge character and have some level of empathy to assist. For diversity, just believe that some people are treated unfairly and assist them based off of being fair. So it's just, yeah, that recognition that some people are treated unfairly. We should address that. And sometimes it can be that simple. I don't see any questions in the audience.
Cheryl
So
has had her hand up
Yes,
for
Cheryl
a
did.
very long time. Feel free to answer. Bring your question forth now, Cheryl.
Thank you so much.
So we've been really struggling with our kids. I've been doing a lot more referrals for my own youth-led kiddos for mental health services and things like that. I am very thankful that they're comfortable with coming to the adults and talking to them and saying, I have this situation going on, and then talking to them. We've talked to parents to get, to kind of advise the parents where they're at. But what I'm struggling with, the people are like, well, what are you guys doing for the community? Right now, I really feel like my youth-led kids are struggling so much. It's kind of made it difficult. I'm like, I need to help them first. Like, I need to make sure they're in a safe space and they're getting the services they need and the help they need before I'm trying to push them out to help the community. But we get units and we're supposed to be doing things in the community, so we're trying to be creative too. But I feel like I'm just adding on. I don't want to add more on top of what they're already struggling with. So I've had a really difficult time with, as the director, like, yes, I need them doing things, but yes, I need them healthy first before I can expect them to be healthy for somebody else in the community. So how are you seeing that as well in your youth kids, or what do you do?
Yeah, sure. I think that's super important. I think a couple pieces is one, it's just important to remind some of our, funders or stakeholders as well that young people are part of the community. So taking care of them helps, broadly take care of the community, I think is a piece, but also so that we can just, that's an essential role because, and I think that's right, that work, if we're not taking, you're right, the old adage of like, you can't pour from an empty cup. If we're not practicing self-care, and so often as adults, right, like we don't do a good job modeling self-care. We're stretched and overwhelmed. And so as we've heard so much from both of our speakers today, young people are stretched because they're modeling what they're seeing from us. And so I think in this time, particularly in a pandemic, when we pause and we just let young people say, it is totally valid right now to feel how you're feeling, to be where you're at. And I'm here to talk. I'm here if you need something, with that and seeing. One thing I'll say for our Young Not Silent, our youth summit this year, is we provided a stipend for the young people who are on the planning committee, because normally we wouldn't do that. Like but we were like, you're at school on Zoom all day, and then there's an additional meeting you have to be on Zoom, and that's taxing. And we wanted to acknowledge that that was taxing for young people. So I think finding those ways too to invest in our young people and to show that like you're stepping up, and we want to honor that.
Yeah, I would just say, Cheryl, you're definitely not alone. I feel like if everybody on this call unmuted, you'd get a lot of people saying they're in the same spot, because we've been there as well. And we're doing what you're doing, is just continuing to give our young people what they need, and continue to be creative and find new ways to impact our community as a whole.
Yeah, I think one of the bits that's been lost because of mostly virtual programming is that we lose the opportunity to engage in the emotional labor that's required for our job, because we don't get 15 minutes of time just to talk with our young people and ask how they're doing. And sometimes people don't recognize that that is work. That takes time, it takes effort. It certainly takes your investment. And so being able to look for other opportunities to be able to engage in that emotional work should be prioritized. And I think we also need our employers to recognize that there needs to be time made for that. Asking a young person about, how they scored on that test might not be explicitly related to prevention, but having that level of involvement in our young people's lives that we follow up with them and say like, hey, can you send me the link to watch your play virtually? That's the kind of stuff that is going to make a difference and keep them coming back, where just talking to them about youth-led programming might not have the same effect. So I want to ask really quickly, if there is one thing that you all could make sure that everybody remembered, like you wave a magic wand and you're able to make sure that everybody remembers this one thing from today's conference a year from now, what is it that you hope people take from today and keep taking? And I want to hear you guys answer this question in the chat too.
I would just say that we just can't be stagnant. We have to continue to evolve. That's the way that our mind thinks, the way that our biases are, or the way that our program operates. Is just continue, like Jason said, continue to be innovative and flexible.
I think my goal would be the idea, myself included, that we continue to move up the ladder toward cultural humility, that we always be mindful of the fact that we don't know what we don't know, and be gracious in asking for, apologizing for errors that you might make and continuing on that educational journey.
So I think one thing that stands out is, and it kind of connects the two, but Albert talked about, when we put pressure on young people, that can kind of weigh on them. And then I think connecting that back to Dr. Ullman's talk as well is about like the limit the growth mindset. And so I'm thinking that too about like how we really meet young people where they are, as we're sometimes having to innovate what we're doing. So we're making sure that we keep them at the center of our conversation.